All right, so I'm going to begin. I'm Samuel Ebersole, and I'm here with MaryLou Smith on her porch in unincorporated Larimer County. It is June 30th, the morning of June 30th, and we're going to start our interview. Let's just start by having you introduce yourself.
Well, the first thing I thought of, June 30th, exactly 1 year ago today, I retired from the Colorado Water Center at CSU. I was policy and collaboration specialist there, and I think that my experience working with people, convening people, and working with people to resolve policy issues related to water is why I'm talking to you, Sam.
Excellent. Tell me a little bit about growing up on the farm, ranch, whichever it was, in New Mexico, and how that may have shaped you and your choices later on in life with regard to water.
Ooh, thanks. Well, I grew up on an irrigated cotton and alfalfa farm, and my family drew its water from wells, and in fact, that was the subject of controversy and conflict and litigation with the state of Texas over the Pecos River and the fact that those wells were drawing down the Pecos River. I didn't know about it then, but later that seems to have played into my interest in water conflict. What I really learned on the farm that stayed with me more than anything probably is that interest in doing something, that interest in making a life that I felt was worthwhile and that would make a contribution, and the ability to work, to really work for what you want or what you feel is right. But the other thing is that I learned to speak Spanish on the farm, and Spanish has been a very important part of my life. My dad at one point grew some green chilies along with his cotton and alfalfa as an experiment for the extension service, and we had Hispanic folks come out to pick the chilies, and I was in high school and practiced my Spanish with them. And soon after that started volunteering to help Hispanic people learn English there in Roswell, New Mexico. And in fact, when I was grown up, I wrote a book about New Mexico for children because I felt that there was a need to dispel the notion that was very prevalent in southeastern New Mexico, very racist, and Hispanics were seen as second-class citizens. So the book, Grandmother's Adobe Dollhouse, is about the different cultures of New Mexico and how they each had a part in building what is now New Mexico. So those are the things I took from the farm.
Great.
So Sam, speaking of water, I see that we're having rain. And growing up in New Mexico on the farm, oh my, if it rained, we just thought it was the most wonderful occurrence in the universe, except when the hay was on the ground. Then it wasn't so good, but I've always loved rain.
How has it been this year here in Larimer County for precipitation?
Say it again?
How has your precipitation been this year in Larimer County?
We're below where we should be, for sure, but not as bad as it is in the southern part of the state, as you know.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. We had early and small runoff, and we haven't had much rain. So.
Yeah.
Tell me how you chose to enter your career, your profession that got you involved in Colorado Water. And I know you had the engineering background, and if that's part of the story, we'll come back to that if not. But either way, tell us how you got into water in general, and then specifically here in Colorado.
Will do. My master's from New Mexico State is in educational psychology. And when I first came to Fort Collins, I worked as assistant director of housing at CSU, and my work was developing programs in married student housing and residence halls to create a sense of community. So working with people, helping people get along, helping people to learn from one another, a lot of multicultural work, especially in married student housing. So when we decided to have a family, that was in 1978. And in 1978, women did not work and have children. Believe it or not, I even put on a program at CSU on dual career families. It was rare to have dual career families. Hard to believe, but that was the case. And I wasn't willing to give up work. So I left the university and became a business partner with Stephen, my husband, who had just started an irrigation engineering company. My degree is not in engineering, but I was very good, having taken one accounting course for this purpose. I was very good at making sure the business made a profit and at making sure we took care of our people, coming from my social services background. And I was pretty good at marketing, too. Having had a jelly roll business when I was in high school to make money for college, I'm an entrepreneur. So I put all that together. And Steve and I were business partners for 30 years in aqua engineering. And we had projects all over the world. We did Euro Disney in Paris. We designed the irrigation for the King's Eastern Province residents of the King of Saudi Arabia. Lots of really interesting projects. And I got to do a lot of travel, not to the Middle East because of issues of women. And my husband said, I couldn't let you go with me to the Middle East because you would have ended up in prison. But I do have a real affinity, by the way, for the Middle East. I did get to go to Tehran, Iran, a few years ago to give a paper on how irrigation engineers and those of us working on the social science aspects of water could work together to improve water policy. And I wore a Magna A, and I felt very comfortable with it. I respect the culture. So I had to put that in there. After aqua engineering, we sold our company to younger shareholders through an ownership transition plan. And I had already, the last 5 years at aqua engineering, I had launched a water conflict resolution emphasis, which was very strange, really, for an engineering company to have an emphasis on conflict resolution. And the reason that happened is because of 9/11. All of those years that I was vice president of aqua engineering, I knew that I would go back to something more directly related to the social sciences. And I had kept up my community work. I was on the Fort Collins Water Board. I was a Girl Scout leader. I was on the board of directors for the Community Foundation. So I met my social services needs that way. And our Girl Scout troop was completely different from most. The girls got to be engaged in activities with women from all different professions. And they made $1,000 profit making nest boxes with woodworking equipment to take a trip to Glenwood Springs. And they learned about international affairs. It was quite the Girl Scout troop. But when 9/11 hit, I said, now is the time. I want to be more directly involved in trying to be part of planting a seed toward peace. So I spent about a year trying to figure out what that would be. I took a bunch of creative writing classes, and finally it occurred to me I knew water, and I wanted to resolve conflict. And at that time, that the process that we now know as the IBCC and the roundtables was just beginning. And I thought, maybe I could get involved with that process, and maybe I could earn some revenue for aqua engineering because I had to pay my way. we were a small company, and though we had 35 employees at one time, we still had to be very careful about cash flow. So I began figuring out how I might find a niche for myself in water conflict resolution. And I did, very, very, very slowly. So that's how I got into the water conflict resolution sphere.
Wow. So I noticed that on many of these projects, some of which you sent to me last evening, you're listed as facilitator. I mean, obviously you have expertise, but more than that, you have the ability to bring different experts to the table and have that process. You're great at facilitating that process of water resolution, or issue resolution, I suppose, or policy formation, what have you. So that's a fascinating background. Let's talk a little bit more about aqua engineering. You've mentioned quite a bit already, but your title was vice president, is that right?
Yeah.
For much of the
That
time?
means if the trash needed emptying, I emptied the trash. If the newsletter needed writing, I did it in a creative way. If we needed to figure out accounting issues, I worked with the people I'd hired to do the bean counting and made sure that worked.
And the types of projects, was it mostly about irrigation or landscaping?
It was all irrigation,
All
and it was mostly landscape irrigation.
Okay.
Stephen Smith finished his master's in 76, and there were no jobs for agricultural engineers because at that point, what's now NRCS and other government agencies did irrigation design for farmers. So there was nowhere really to make a living as an agricultural engineer. So Stephen took the principles of agricultural engineering and took them to landscape engineering. For instance, the use of weather stations to monitor evapotranspiration. He worked with the city of Pueblo and their park system, and they installed weather station network that could interrogate what was happening at all their parks. And the first year they installed the program Stephen developed, they saved $100,000 on their water budget. So that was the beginning of aqua engineering. We actually did some contracting at first, and when Steve was in the Middle East doing some of the projects, one summer I was in charge of contracting, and that's the last summer we did contracting, because I convinced Stephen we weren't making any money at it, and it was a hell of a lot of work. However, it did keep Steve slim. And once we stopped contracting and he was working more behind a desk, well, he was no longer slim. But we had wonderful, wonderful projects. The company is still doing very well, doing a lot of work in Phoenix on all kinds of sports complexes, and became well known as the designer of choice of irrigation systems for cemeteries. Lots of good work, lots of good people.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit more about the transition to Colorado Water Institute, and maybe you can tell me also about how that later became Colorado Water
Center.
Colorado Water Center. If you could talk a little bit about that as well, that transition.
Ooh, this is a fun story. When I decided to do this kind of work, I had not one bit of credibility. Nunca. Nada. So the first thing that I did was, well, I spent months and months and months studying up on conflict resolution. I read, I listened, I went to a couple of courses on conflict resolution, intensive courses, but I knew nothing. I'd never done it, so my credibility was nil. So the first thing that I did was to write a paper to give a paper for the U.S. Committee on Irrigation and Drainage on the importance of people listening to each other's point of view in the water arena. Well, they had never had anything like that. Their programs were all on which drip emitter is going to work best on this particular crop. But they listened, and so then I had something I could refer to. Then I found a woman in Boulder who wanted to get some clients in the water arena. So she and I decided, well, we'll work together. And that meant I could put on our website that I had a partner who was in conflict resolution. Whew. So she and I we did one thing together was all. But that helped. Little tiny bits of credibility. Then I got a job with I went to all the IBCC meetings, every one. And I started going to the roundtable meetings. And so people would see me and I would just start talking. And so I got a job being the facilitator for the IBCC, Interbasin Compact Committee's Public Education Committee. And that gave me more exposure and made it look like I knew a little bit of something when I was just... So it's very, 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 very organic. Interestingly, at one point, I met Reagan, and he was looking for a facilitator to help him put on a meeting of agricultural producers who belong to different commodity groups throughout Colorado. The corn growers, the dairy people, the cattlemen, all of these different groups had begun talking about wanting to speak with one voice in terms of agriculture and water, because all of these issues were coming up in Colorado about water, and they knew that if they didn't have a united front, in their view, the environmentalists and the urban folks were going to take over. So they wanted to see if they could come together. Well, Reagan and I had a really good time organizing that. And frankly, because I was trying to gain credibility, I put into that planning probably 8 times more than you really could afford to do as a consultant, because I knew if that went well, that could really help my reputation and get me more jobs. So we did a really great job. I actually took a triangle to call the meetings to order, and kind of built up some rapport. When I say meetings, it was a one-day event, and I was so intent on how we planned it that I wanted to make sure when we had breakout groups that people went to the breakout group we had planned for them, because we carefully planned the diversity. I was so intent on them going to the right place. We had colored footsteps put on which color is your badge and which footsteps you follow to your breakout room. That's the level of detail. Maybe that was a little overboard, but you know what? People knew we cared and that this was something important. And so Reagan had me train extension people that he was working with to be the facilitators of each breakout group, such that we got some really good content. And in coming back, instead of having each group stand up and report on their content, I used a technique that I dreamed up. It's probably been done hundreds of other places, but I just thought this is appropriate. We had a panel made up of people from each of those groups, and then I facilitated a conversation or a dialogue among them. So it wasn't a report out, it was a dialogue. And out of that, they began to say, maybe we should start an organization, or maybe we should be a committee of the, I can't remember the name of the group that all the ag folks belong to. And they were sort of hem-hawing, and I remember very distinctly saying, okay, we have about 40 more minutes. What's it going to be? Are you going to form a group to decide? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do that? And I was insistent that they had to have a plan for what's next. And frankly, I think that was important. And very soon thereafter, they formed the Colorado Ag Water Alliance, which is still going to this day. So again, I feel like my work, there's nothing brilliant about it. There's actually, as a facilitator, I never have felt I was that great a facilitator because I'm a little too directive. But I felt like that's what has been needed, to kind of push a little bit. Not to push my point of view, but to push for action and not just sitting around hem-hawing and trying to figure out, well, what shall we do? So those were the very, very early days.
Awesome. So my next question was about the Ag Water Alliance, but I think you covered that unless there's anything else you want to go into more detail about that.
Well, one thing I'm really proud about, again, always trying to come up with billable dollars. Always. I felt very strongly that people didn't understand irrigation watering, ag water, and that there were lots of misconceptions about, well, if only ag would conserve their water, we'd have plenty. And I had learned from my work in an irrigation engineering company, that wasn't necessarily the case. And so Reagan and 2 or 3 other people, I think, Mark Sponsler from Corn Growers, Kelly DiNatale, who is now a consulting engineer, and maybe a couple of others, wrote a white paper, 10, 12, 15 pages on that subject, trying to dispel the notion that it's just a simple matter of conserving ag water. And I thought that paper was brilliant, but I also thought nobody was going to read it. So I convinced the Colorado Ag Water Alliance to come up with some money for me, it was a very small amount, to do a brochure that would explain that in a layperson's terms. And I got an artist, came up with great graphics, and I wrote it, and then I had to work with Reagan, Kelly, and Mark to make sure it was accurate. And let me tell you, it ain't easy to make something scientifically complex easy for the layperson. And it's like that phrase that I've never figured out exactly who said it. I'm sorry I wrote you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. Well, it took lots of time and lots of going back and forth with those fellows to say something short that was still accurate. And I'm really proud of that. It's still on their website. They still use it. So that's the Colorado Ag Water Alliance. They're a great group of people.
That's great. You've worked with both the Arkansas River Basin and the South Platte Basin. Also noticed some of your work was in the Colorado River Basin. I mean, you've touched a lot of basins. Anything specific about the Arkansas and or South Platte that you want to talk about?
Since you're from Pueblo, you will love this. When the Arkansas Basin Roundtable started, very early on, people from the small communities like La Junta, Lamar, brought to the round table a declaration that let the round table declare that we will not have any of this urban agencies coming down and buying up our water. Well, Wayne Vandersher from the Colorado Springs Water Utility and Mark Pfeiffer from Aurora Water Utility, who were on the round table, said, well, we understand, but we think that statement should be nuanced a little bit. So the round table set up a committee. And after a couple of months, they said, well, we either need an emergency medical technician or a facilitator. So they hired me. And that was wonderful, because at that point, I had very little under my belt. I loved it. I just loved it. At one of our very first meetings, and you caught on about the emergency medical technician, right. They were fighting like crazy. And really, actually, there was one roundtable member when two roundtable members who were on that committee almost got into a fist fight. It's true. So, one of the very first things I did, and again, much of this is by the seat of my pants. It's common sense, much of it. I asked the people gathered, ag and urban and environmental we had there, but mostly ag and urban, what do you folks have in common? Let's see if we can figure out something you have in common. And there were 2 or 3 things, but the major thing is we don't want to spend all of our money on lawyers. We want to figure this out because lawyers are so expensive. Let's not do it that way. Let's figure something out. And that was a real breakthrough. You could feel it in the room. Mm-hmm. We do have something in common. Another thing that happened, that an experienced facilitator would say, oh, that's nothing. But for me, it was major because I'm new at this, remember? And I'm trying to build my confidence. And I think I did a pretty good job of showing confidence I didn't feel. But at one point, director of water for Colorado Springs, or person in a high position, Wayne Vandersher, was speaking from the urban point of view, and a gentleman from Upper Arkansas was speaking from the ag point of view. And man, oh man, they were having it out. And actually, I'm not so sure I should say they were having it out. The gentleman from the Upper Arkansas area was really, really, really ragging on this urban guy. Really just telling him how awful the urban management was and how terrible they were. And he just wouldn't even let the other side talk at all. And at one point I said, Dennis, thank you. I appreciate your being so passionate and sharing what you really feel. That's helpful. And then I said, I'm going to ask Wayne, I'm wondering what you heard. Could you tell us what you heard Dennis say? It was almost miraculous. Wayne Vandersher did a beautiful job of really expressing the anguish and the points that Dennis had made. He was able to show compassion for his point of view. He showed accuracy. Things switched just like that. Dennis said, oh, I guess you do get it. And it really, really switched the dynamic in that group from then on. It was just amazing that just to be listened to. So Anyway, that's one of my favorite stories of all time. And the committee, what ended up happening is the committee came up with a set of guidelines. If you are going to transfer water from agriculture, here's how to do it. You should be concerned about this, environmental effects on the rural community. Mark Pfeiffer was very, very instrumental in helping us develop that guide in conjunction with a guy named Dan Hendricks from the Rocky Mountain, or the Rocky Ford Canal, I believe, was the ditch company. I think I've got that wrong, but I've forgotten some of the details of those names down there. But the two of them worked together, ag and urban, and took all the ideas of the group, and then I helped them with the editing. And we came up with a guideline that the Arkansas Basin Roundtable adopted. The problem was that the Roundtable couldn't decide what to do with the document. Would the document form some sort of mandate? Would it simply be a guidelines? What would they do with these guidelines? And as it turns out, those guidelines have always just sort of been there, and they referred back to them many times. And I think it was a very, very, very helpful step. But there were some who wished that they could have made law out of it, for instance. Much of the work that I've done has drawn on my writing ability. My ability to put into writing the conclusions of groups, and to do it in a way that is interesting and somewhat creative. I consider myself a creative nonfiction writer, and I think that's important, to be able to say those things and draw in stories in a way that make people interested instead of just gloom and doom. And so anyway, that was the Arkansas Basin Roundtable. Has always been important for me. And then I worked with Jay Winter with the Super Ditch and got to do some facilitating with the farmers as they were forming the Super Ditch. And I worked in the Arkansas Valley with Southeastern Water Conservancy District as they were developing a water conservation plan for those who wanted to build the conduit, because those little communities needed a water conservation plan. It was the first water conservation plan that a group of communities went in on instead of just one community. Worked with Gene Van Pelt there. So I like the Arkansas a lot.
Do you have hope that the conduit is going to happen?
Surely it'll happen. I think I've got 20 more years on this globe. Surely it will happen before then. What a need.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. How about the South Platte Basin? Any stories from that one that you want to share?
Yeah, I did a little bit of work with the South Platte Roundtable, very little. I think my favorite South Platte work was working with Reagan Wascom when the legislature said that the Colorado Water Institute was mandated, but they gave money to do it, to come up with a study of how this issue over groundwater and surface water could be worked out. And could there be ways that we could manage the aquifer cooperatively? We came up with wonderful ideas, and the legislature really has not done much at all with it. This was a big, big interest of mine. Even before I joined the Colorado Water Institute, on my own, with no funding, I started a think tank of people to look at that issue. And out of that, I learned that there was such potential for using groundwater in times of drought and using surface water to put back in the ground in times of plenty. But the institutions are set up such that they have to be managed. They're supposedly managed conjunctively, but but they're administered conjunctively. They're not managed conjunctively, so that the rules say this will happen, the rules say this will happen. Whereas if you owned both, you could manage them so that it could work beautifully. And Reagan, oh man, did he work hard. We all worked hard. And my role was to convene people in different locations to get input for our report. And so I enjoyed that very much. Otherwise, on the South Platte, my work has primarily been on the Poudre River. You may or may not know that the Northern Integrated Supply Project, Northern District's plan to build a reservoir, 2 reservoirs in fact, off-channel reservoirs, in order to meet the needs of some of the burgeoning communities around here, City of Evans, I'm trying to think of that, I'm trying to think of a specific name of the community, but I won't come up with, but many different small communities. But in addition, about a third of Fort Collins residents get their water from Fort Collins Levelland Water District, and they're a player in that project and need the project. Well, there was huge controversy. I'll make this as brief as I can. Early on, when there was controversy over Northern wanting to put a project up on the Poudre, on the river, the environmental group Friends of the Poudre were successful in preventing that, but they made a deal with Northern that they would help Northern get through a project if they would go off channel. So Northern's biggest mistake, and I've said it to Eric Wilkinson many times, is why didn't they immediately get those people on their committee to plan the new project? But they didn't. They didn't involve environmentalists. They just went about and planned their new project. Meanwhile, Friends of the Poudre somewhat petered out, and a new group, Save the Poudre, came on board and did not have those allegiances to that agreement. Wasn't a written agreement. And Save the Poudre became very vehement and major conflict. So Reagan Wascom and I were asked by the Community Foundation of Northern Colorado, would we convene a dialogue, a community dialogue on the issue? And Reagan is a little bit more subtle than I am. But I basically, I can't remember whether he was, I can't remember exactly, but basically I said, no, that would never work. All we would be doing is giving people a chance to argue. They'd already done a little bit of an attempt at this at the Front Range Community Center. I went to the meeting and, it was terrible, even though it was facilitated. The facilitator, Martine Carcassonne, who's a brilliant facilitator, wasn't successful. I thought, if Martine isn't successful, Reagan and I are not going to be successful. So we said, what we will do is convene a dialogue about the Poudre River and about Northern Colorado's water future, in which we bring together people to learn about the Poudre. How is the Poudre administered in terms of water rights? What are the Poudre's environmental needs? Which urban agencies use water from the Poudre, and how do they do that? And what is water quality like? Let's learn about the Poudre and then begin to see where we might find common ground. And it worked. I don't mean we still have the controversy over NISP. But out of that, the first meeting we had was 350 people. And the Community Foundation put it on, had a real nice set of hors d'oeuvres and even beer, if I remember. And we planned that thing out so carefully. Martine Carcassonne from the Center for Public Deliberation at CSU helped us. We what the community foundation and the group they had called University Connections was enough concerned about it that they had a plainclothes police officer there in case there was trouble. Believe it or not. We planned that thing such that it would not be a debate. Instead, and I won't go into the design, but we designed it so carefully, and we gave people the opportunity to, as the evening went on, write answers to questions like, what I'm most concerned about the pooter is, a question I have about the pooter is, if I could have my best wishes, it would be, and then we had people stand up and read those I statements. So instead of saying, those damn people who want to dam up the pooter are terrible, or the ag folks saying, well, where in the hell do you think we're going to get water for the food you enjoy? Instead, people were saying things like, I'm concerned that if we don't manage our water better, we won't have water to stay in the river for fish. Now, that's a lot different. Or somebody say, I'm afraid if we don't pay attention to the need of agriculture, we're going to make some decisions that aren't going to be very good. I mean, that's a lot different. I'm proud of these things. These are little tiny seeds that, frankly, Reagan and I, working together, were able to plant. Tiny seeds, nothing brilliant, just tiny seeds and a lot of stick-to-itiveness. Out of that, we formed the Pooter Runs Through It Study Action Work Group. And out of that came the Pooter River Forum that meets once a year, brings in about 300 people to learn about the Pooter. But the Pooter Runs Through It then had a committee that began figuring out how could the environmental folks who wanted to see water stay in the river be paid in sort of an augmentation plan to keep water in the river, just as groundwater folks buy surface water so they can continue to pump. It was a new concept, and Dan Brown, a local attorney, came up with the idea. And that committee has now been successful getting some legislation passed. So that was the ag folks, the environmental folks, working together on something unheard of. So again, these aren't, the successes are not huge, very incremental. But as the manager of the North Pooter Irrigation Company, who was on the Pooter Runs Through It Study Action Work Group the first couple of years before he retired, as he said when he left, he said, you know, I think the most important thing I learned is that those environmentalists over there, they don't have horns under their ball caps. So we've made some progress. So that's the South Platte. Also on the South Platte, again, MaryLou, figure out how to say this briefly. I was working with a group of farmers and urban folks who wanted to figure out how can we use these ag-urban transfers effectively on the Pooter. And at one point, we had the opportunity to get a grant, and a couple of members of the group and I went after the grant. We got a $100,000 grant, and then we had a couple of new people on the committee who had not been there all through the beginning, but came on at the end, and they did not like what we were going to do with the grant. The grant had to do with studying how you might create some sort of a water bank where a group of, where you use probably tax money to buy water that would stay in the Pooter and be used primarily for agriculture, but various urban groups could lease it out from time to time. It was a concept, and we just got the $100,000 to study the concept. Well, a couple of new players who are very powerful in their agencies caused a huge uproar, and we had to tell the donor we can't use the money for that purpose. Well, she had already given the money. She had already gotten her tax break. So you know what we ended up using the money for was to develop a water literate leaders course for northern Colorado, for Loveland, Windsor, Fort Collins, and Greeley, to bring together not the middle management people who were part of this group that we got the pushback from, but city managers, mayors, council people, real estate people, attorneys, who could have more power in terms of making decisions about water in northern Colorado, and we wanted to teach them about water. The same things we'd learned in Poudre Runs Through It. How do the ditch companies work? What are the environmental organizations concerned about? How does water quality work? How do the urban folks determine how much water they need and when? And out of that, we brought in Eric Wilkinson, who 15 years earlier had been part of a group in Weld and Larimer County that were trying to develop the same sort of thing we had been talking about, a water bank that the water would stay basically in ag but could be used as needed in drought for urban. And he came in and talked to that group, and out of that group then has come a group interested in working on that concept for northern Colorado, and it's being ring-led by the mayor, the city manager of Greeley, Roy Otto. He just fell into this hook, line, and sinker. He was in our first year's class of water literate leaders, and he knew the legacy of W.D. Farr and what W.D. Farr had done in this region in terms of looking at water issues and how could we best work together toward water. And he, frankly, wanted to leave his own legacy. And so he has been instrumental in trying to move this forward, this idea of let's think about the future instead of just standing by while, frankly, northern Colorado communities are buying up the water and taking it south. Let's figure out a way that we can work together. By the way, City of Thornton, as you know, came up here and surreptitiously bought water in the early 80s from farms, bought farms, and that's been a real conflict. However, we have on the Poudre Runs Through It Study Action Work Group someone from the City of Thornton, and we built bridges there. So my work in the South Platte has been the Poudre and then the work on groundwater. Fun work. I sure have had fun working on those projects, especially with Reagan.
This is kind of just a side note, but the recharging the aquifer in wet years, was it called aquifer storage at the time when you were?
You're thinking about storing, okay, you're thinking about artificially storing.
Right.
This has more to do with using the aquifer that's already there to
Gotcha.
store.
Okay.
So in concept, for instance, let's say that it was a really dry year, the surface water user who has prime rights could use the water from the aquifer rather than just the groundwater folks getting to use it. But the whole idea of aquifer recharge, you may know about Gary Barber's work in that area, and I secured a contract with Gary to help him put on a statewide conference on aquifer recharge. And we did a paper on that.
Wow. I think you know every single person that I have ever met who
On where?
who works in water.
Oh.
Well, starting New York Salt Basin, which are most of my contacts.
Oh,
but-
there are wonderful people working in water in Colorado, many of whom we would not agree on things politically, but that has never been an issue. I've been working late in my time at CSU. I worked with the Republican River, which is part of the South Platte, and they were trying to figure out a way, now that they've pretty much worked out their issues with Nebraska and Kansas on the Republican River, they wanted to come up with a way that they could conserve water so that they can make their groundwater last. You know, they're on the Ogallala. If they could make it last 20 more years beyond where they think that it's going to last. And that was a big issue because they couldn't, some people wanted to just keep making their money, which their communities need that income, until it went dry. Others wanted to make sure it could last longer for the communities. So had a wonderful opportunity to work with them and come up with some funds from the South Platte Basin Roundtable to do a study of what kind of policies they might be able to come up with that they could agree on that would help them reduce pumping. There is still an issue there, but at least they made a positive step in that direction.
All the talk about the roundtables, I have to ask, have you had some working opportunities with Russell George?
In the very, very beginning, yeah. I got to meet Russell the first time when I was in that period of time where I hadn't had any jobs, but I was giving presentations. And we were at the Gunnison Water Workshop. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
It's at Western State. They call it something different now, but it was a wonderful summer workshop, and people from all over the state would come. And I gave a paper there with a PowerPoint presentation about the possibility of conflict resolution in water. And Russell George was there because he had just gotten the HB 1177 legislation passed. So I got to meet him there. Never really worked closely with him.
So he was already working on the roundtable concept before you may have had an interaction with him about the idea of conflict
Right.
resolution.
I think that summer was the summer before the roundtables were going to be meeting in the fall.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So it was, okay, kind of happened in parallel. Okay.
Well, and I was able to kind of tag on to that.
Mm-hmm.
That process was very important to get people to start thinking about let's work together. And then I think the work that I did helped it along a little, and of course the fact it was there helped me. Remember, I was still at Aqua Engineering. I needed to get billable dollars. And even once I joined the Water Institute, Reagan didn't have budget for me. There was a hiring freeze at CSU, and the only way that Reagan could hire me was if I agreed to do the work to bring in grant funds. So at that point in time, through Aqua Engineering, I had gotten some funds from the Walton Family Foundation for a project working with CSU. So Reagan and I had a couple of projects together where I was with Aqua Engineering, he was with CSU, and we worked together. So when that kind of provided the seed money for me to come to CSU, I was a full CSU employee. I wasn't a contractor or a consultant. I was a full CSU employee, but it was my job to make sure there was money in the budget for my monthly salary. And Reagan started me off at a really nice salary, which was great, but then I had to backfill it. So that's pretty fun to think about. I worked really hard marketing, and the first year and a half, I only made enough money to be paid part-time, but I worked 50, 60 hours a week. But that was okay because I could get by. And so that started a wonderful new opportunity because Reagan had access to USDA grants, for instance. And the work that we did, the project that the Waltons founded us for, was that project I sent you, the one where we brought together people, ag, urban, and environmental, from all across the western United States to look at various ways that different groups were working together to maximize the potential for water by cooperating instead of staying in conflict. Mm-hmm. So that was a wonderful project. And then later, the Walton Family Foundation funded us to work with two separate groups, a group in Arizona and a group in Colorado, ag and environmental stakeholders in both states, to take them to Oregon for a 4 or 5 day field trip to see how ag and urban were working together in Oregon to resolve water conflict. So that was so cool because we got to view projects, for instance, on the John Day River, where a major rancher had agreed that instead of getting 3 cuttings of hay a year, he would go for the first 2. He'd irrigate his hay for the first 2. For the third, he left his water in the river for the fish when they needed it, the salmon. Mm-hmm. And the agricultural organization, the Three Sisters Irrigation Company, paid him for that water the amount he would have made off the cutting of hay. The funding from all of that came from the Bonneville Power Authority, because when they came in and the Power Authority caused such problems with the salmon, they had to put in huge amounts of money to mitigate their negative effect, and that money then was used to create more habitat for salmon. Isn't that a beautiful mm-hmm. story of cooperation? And it's worked beautifully in Oregon. So we took them and showed them that, and of course the most important part was they were on a bus for days at a time. They flew up there, but we were on a bus as we toured, and they got to know each other. And again, the ag folks got to know that the environmentalists didn't have horns under their ball caps. And vice versa.
Right. I'm supposed to ask you about no Chico brush and you into
Oh my goodness.
You're working in the Colorado Basin.
Oh, I forgot about no Chico brush. Well, Chico brush is an invasive species, and when agricultural land, when the water goes away, the Chico brush starts coming up. And a group down there wanted to be sure that as the Colorado River has more pressure on its water, and we don't have enough for all the uses, they wanted to be sure that water for agriculture is preserved. And they're in the Gunnison area, Montrose area. So they came up with a group called No Chico Brush. And one of their big supporters, whose name I don't remember, was on ads for Olathe sweet corn. He was on King Super ads for many years, and he was very instrumental in getting that group going. And it was a group, the Trout Unlimited was very active, as were the farm groups. And they had an attitude of sort of like the west slope versus the east slope, not one more drop. They didn't want to see one more drop come out of agriculture. So working with them was fascinating. I loved that as well. Carrie Dennison with Trout Unlimited was one of the prime movers in that group. That was really a fascinating experience. And along that time, in that same, our USDA project gave us funds to do a lot of things that were sort of broad. And that was one of the projects that I was able to work with them under that. Along that same time, we started a group at CSU of students who were in environmental sciences and students who were in ag sciences. We did 3 groups, I think, and I had a grad student, Hannah Love, who facilitated them. I helped her the first year, and then she did them after that. But we brought these groups of students together, ag and environmental, to learn about water and to figure out how they might bridge the gap, because the ag students, had manure on their boots, and the environmental students were, they had their water bottles. Back then, not everybody had water bottles. And they began learning about water, and they formed good understandings through their dialogue. And at least 2 students that I know of are now in water. One of them working for the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District in Gunnison, and one working for a department at CSU, and he was involved with the Irrigation Innovation Consortium that my husband worked with Reagan and others to start, and he was doing some work there to develop and he was from the ag end of things. The woman in Gunnison was in the environmental, and they both remembered very much what they learned, and that's had a good part in their careers.
Fantastic. We addressed the Ogallala and the Republican River Basin. I think we already got there. So the content of the video that Justin is going to be putting together for the Poudre Heritage Alliance is about the Poudre River Forum. So I know you've spoken to some about it already, but can you tell me more about your involvement with the forum, how it got started, and what that has meant to the health of the Poudre River?
I would love to. As long as you promise me, I'll get to talk to you about CSU Water Sustainability Fellows.
Yes, that's on the list here.
It's on the list.
It is.
Okay. Well, the Poudre River Forum. First of all, the Cache la Poudre heritage effort, if I remember correctly, got started about the same time as the Poudre runs through it. And man, have they done some wonderful things. I'm really proud of what they've done. Robert Ward is a good friend of mine, and he was on their early board. And so we began working with them pretty early on, and they have been a really big supporter of the Poudre River Forum. The Poudre River Forum was one of 3 major projects that came out of that first year's Poudre Runs Through It Study Action Work Group. One being the flows committee I told you about that resulted in some legislation. The Poudre River Forum was again an opportunity to bring people from the communities together to learn about water, and from that to have a better attitude toward the other sectors. And we built into those forums opportunities for dialogue. So it's just finished its 7th, and it's been a major force for convening people from different points of view. The next step needs to be water-savvy citizens, where ordinary citizens in these communities have a chance to learn about water so that they won't be so prone to draw conclusions based on biased stands that are taken on things like the Northern Integrated Supply Project. It's really easy for some to be very pro-NISP, some to be very anti-NISP, either side not understanding fully what the issues are. And that's really important, I think.
This is off my list of questions, but do you feel like the political polarization we're experiencing in the country at large is reflected in the water community on a smaller scale? I mean, do you think that we are just becoming more isolated in our points of view and
Wow, that's a great question. You know, to tell you the truth, I don't think that.
Okay.
As we're becoming more and more polarized politically, I actually think in terms of water, I think we're becoming more collaborative. Fascinating.
So we should be the model for the rest of the country.
Well, you know, there are things going on throughout the whole country where people are becoming more collaborative on water. Actually, that it's not like it's all the problems are solved. They aren't. Problems are still there, but people are doing better at collaborating. What I see is the biggest problem in water collaboration is that we're stuck in institutions, and we as human beings don't seem to be very good at moving beyond the boundaries that our institutions put us in. And it's because we're so afraid we'll lose what we have. The groundwater people, I'll say it this way, the surface water users on the Platte, if they began to think about maybe we might work on these ideas of sharing, why should they? They had the upper hand. They had the primary water right. Why should they chance it? And that's what I see as the problem in resolving these issues, is that we're stuck in our positions, and we're stuck in our institutions that say, well, this is the way we've always managed this. We have to keep doing it that way. But it is changing. One of the things that Reagan and I got to do was to work with Dick Wolf, the state engineer, to convene a group of people who would look at this issue of use it or lose it. And frankly, what we came up with is there's no use it or lose it. The water commissioners in each district are responsible to make sure that an irrigator only uses what they need. And even though those irrigators tend to take their full diversion right, they're really not legally allowed to divert more than that crop needs. So it's much more complex than meets the eye. But for them to begin administering the water the way legally it's supposed to be would change a century of practice. And so all of this is more than meets the eye. It's like we only see the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg below is much more complex.
Are you staying dry, or are you getting
Yeah,
a little
I'm dry.
purified? Okay,
Isn't this
all right.
rain wonderful?
Okay. I think we covered the NISP adequately. So let's talk about your CSU Water Sustainability Fellows, your work with minority students at CSU. And is it also Metro, the water center there?
We worked with them some, yeah.
Some, but mostly CSU. Tell me how your interest. Yeah.
I've told you that I speak Spanish, and I wrote the book for children to try to help them realize the cultural richness of New Mexico includes the Hispanic culture and the various Native American cultures, and as well as the Anglos who came back from back east. And it's been a big theme of mine forever. When I had my Girl Scout troop, the only craft project we ever did was to make miniature piñatas to go on the city council Christmas tree to show appreciation for the Hispanic culture in our community. So this has been a big theme of mine, and it's always been an issue with me that when I go to water meetings in Colorado, there are no brown faces. There are almost no black faces, but even no brown faces, even though 20% of our population in Colorado is Hispanic. So all along, I'd say to Reagan, what are we going to do about this? Can't we do something? And without going into too much detail, came up with the idea of finding a group of students, Hispanic students, who we could teach about water the same way we were teaching the whole gamut of water to people on the Poudre River, the water leaders. And there was down the hall from me at CSU a gentleman named Elias Quinones, who was the counselor for a group of DACA students, the program that allowed students who came here illegally with their parents when they were children to mentor them, help them with the finances, etc. So we worked together and we got a group of DACA students who would come together, and we worked with a gentleman named Paul Hellman, who was very interested in sustainability. So we called it the CSU Sustainability Fellows, and he came up with the idea of calling it Fellows to give it some oomph. Well, we had 8 students, and we paid them a little stipend to come learn about water, and they did, and it was great fun. And then at the end of I was determined to find them summer jobs. And so we got funding for them to go to Denver that first summer and work with kids in Globeville and Elyria Swanson, which is a Hispanic neighborhood in Denver that's very low income. It's the neighborhood where the National Western Center complex is being built, that CSU will have a water center there. So we got the funding. It was hard getting the funding, but we got a little bit here, a little bit there. Oh my, I've gotten really good at that. $2,000, $8,000, and then you have to monitor 8 different budgets because each group giving you money wants it managed in a different way, and CSU doesn't make it easy to manage all of that. But those students went into those communities, and we planned a summer water festival. And we never did have the summer water festival because we planned to do it in September. So we planned all summer, and it was not easy. It wasn't easy at all. We were meeting in a recreation center in Denver in the low-income community of Globeville, and oh my God, there was no air conditioning. We were sweating, literally sweating. And we were working with the city of Denver, and they were great, but their program was sort of disjointed, and they'd say, oh, we'll be there at such a time, we'll transport you, and they wouldn't show up. And sorry, Michael Hancock. Wait a minute, Michael Hancock was the mayor, and he was great. But the staff member was great, and I can't remember his name, and we loved him, but he wasn't very reliable. By the way, Michael Hancock came to Fort Collins that fall and met with my group of students at a restaurant. It was just great. So we planned the festival to be in September, but the school year began in the middle of August, and all of the plans were hard to keep going to September. Plus, at the end of August, President Trump pulled the rug out from under DACA. And my students were devastated. Forget their plans for a water festival in Denver. They didn't know what was going to happen. So the water festival didn't happen that year. But guess what? The next year it did. We had 2 or 3 of the same students plus a new group of students. And by the way, not only did the students from CSU get paid, we found students to work with in the Globeville, Elyria, Swansea community, who the city of Denver paid them through a program they had. And all these students got paid to work on this project, both summers. Second summer it did happen, and the third summer it happened. But I'm really proud of that project. And some of the students then would go with me to statewide conferences, and they were typically the only brown faces in the meeting. One was in Vail, and they went to the meetings, and then later they got a scholarship to go, and later the organization, the Colorado Watershed Assembly and the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, who put on the event in Vail, asked them to give a report as their payment for going, and the report was, you need to bring in more Hispanic speakers. So again, tiny, 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 tiny little seeds. But what fun to see them blossom. Some of them falter. Some of them grow kind of fast and straight and then just be kind of ugly, but standing there still trying, you know. But what fun.
Awesome. Okay, this is now kind of the legacy question, big picture question. What do you feel has been your greatest accomplishment over your years working in water?
Wow. Thank you for the opportunity to answer that.
I'm going to ask you the other question too.
Okay.
What was your biggest failure? So.
Okay. You know, John Bartholow with the USGS was a member of Save the Pooter. He was on their board, and he was in our first, he was on the board of the steering committee of the Pooter Runs Through It. Staunch environmentalist, and yet a wonderful, he would listen, and he was always a little skeptical, but, so John Bartholow, once we were in a conversation about what the Pooter Runs Through It was doing, and he said something to the effect of, MaryLou, don't you feel good about the contribution you have made toward the health of the Pooter River? And I said, no. To tell you the truth, John, that isn't something that I've really thought too much about. What I feel good about is the opportunity to bring people of different points of view together, and water and the Pooter River were the medium. I'm sorry. But yeah, I'm glad for the Pooter River to be healthy, but I'm also glad for the Pooter River to be providing water for agriculture. And I'm glad it's providing water for the City Park Golf Course, even though I'm a little bit biased against putting water on turf. I'd rather see it go on native landscapes. But to me, the legacy is a little opportunity to just bring people together just a little bit more. Nothing big. Again, the seed planting. That's it for me. Just bringing people together to figure out, maybe we could solve this without going to war. And that, again, takes me back to the roots of 9/11. I was furious about the fact that we as human beings couldn't come up with better ways. And frankly, I felt the United States was much to blame for the conflict that resulted in 9/11. And I felt very strongly I want to be a part of something that has to do with getting people to communicate. So that's the legacy. And the disappointment You know, the disappointment, but even the disappointment I accept, because I practice Buddhist meditation even though I'm not a Buddhist, and I believe that the wolf and the warp, the good and the bad, the yin and the yang, it's all part of it all, so I have to have the disappointment along with the other. I guess the disappointment is that really my ability was not very much. I'm really not a good facilitator. I'm good at convening people. Getting them together is my best. I'm good at convening. I'm good at planning how things would work. But when it really comes to facilitation, and Reagan will agree, I have a little bit of a tendency to be a little too directive. But what the hell? It all was part of the stew. It worked, and it helped me plant the seeds. And if I'd been a better facilitator, actually, I'm not sure we would have accomplished as much, because sometimes goading people on and getting them to make decisions and getting them to agree on something required more than just strict facilitation, or at least it required more. It required pretty active facilitation.
Great. What big changes over the course of your career have affected how you've done your job? Has there been, and it could be any kind of change, technological change, attitude change, legislative change. What has made your job much different than it was when you started?
I think I could talk better about the change I think needs to happen. Technologically, I think we need to be telling our stories in graphics and in visuals more. I had a little bit of opportunity to do that, hiring Noah Besser, who is a cartoonist who was able to do some videos that explained concepts like groundwater, surface water. So I think we need to keep working on ways to tell the story using the technology that's available. There's been some change in using decision-making software to get groups together to use some sort of software to put parameters together. But I think there could be some real breakthroughs in that arena. But the institutional changes, I think, are the big ones. I used to have a strip of paper on my computer monitor that said something about the only way we're going to have change is to break down the institutions that we've built up to organize things, that to try to amend those institutions. We're seeing it now with racism and our understanding, deeper understanding. Even these last few weeks, we're seeing that we've got to rethink things. It isn't just a matter of amending an institution. We've got to really think differently, and that is so difficult when we're so polarized, when we have such different views of what it would take to have better institutions, better ways of governing ourselves, better ways of living together as human beings. So that's the change I see needed both in water. Boy, do I see it at the university. Boy, I was never an academic. Reagan has to be, but this thing about doing research and then trying out this, and then gradually figuring out what might work better. I don't think we can afford that kind of thing outside of some very highly hard science things. In social sciences, we've got to get out there and do and learn from doing. We can't just, and I'm worried about our research because the research dollars are coming from groups that have a dog in the fight. How does that go?
I was just going to say agenda, but yes.
Who have an agenda. That's not the way to come up with objective information. So whether it's water, whether it's the work that I'm doing now, trying to work with Hispanic folks to enlarge their opportunities, we've got to look beyond the institutions and the rules and the way that we've done it. And maybe this is a time we're going to change. I think we are. And it will affect water positively too, I think. Even the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, now Water Education Colorado, they just put out a Spanish edition of one of their newsletters, the one on social justice in water. That's a huge step. So I think even water will make this kind of change.
Great. Have you felt any particular barrier or disadvantage of being a woman in this very male-centric kind of field? Has that been an obstacle to overcome, or have you noticed any change over time that you've been involved in water?
I've seen some wonderful changes in women being accepted in water. So that is a change I have seen in the years that I've been involved, definitely an acceptance of women in water. That has been a big change. And I would say at this point, women are very much respected in water circles. And part of my interest in seeing what we could do about getting more Hispanic involvement in water issues was because I saw, well, now we have a lot of women involved. Now let's look into this Hispanic involvement issue.
Great.
I don't think I was aware of any feeling that I was at a disadvantage of being a woman, because I was so busy fighting my disadvantage of not having credibility in what I was trying to do and having to build credibility as I went. So I was so concentrated on building credibility as a facilitator that I don't think I had too much concern about the other. I think it's important for us at this point to say that if those viewing this, if anybody views this in the archives, and it looks like I'm shaking, it's because it's cold now. The weather, that rain brought some cold, and Sam and I are both sitting here sort of shaking.
Are you noticing that I'm shivering a little bit?
I don't want people to think I
Just-
got scared toward the end.
Just for the record, that's
Yeah.
right. Let the record show that we're enduring through a cold snap. Who in the course of your career did you look to for leadership, to be a mentor, and then who have you been able to mentor?
Well, the person who's been a mentor to me is Reagan Wascom. Reagan is a visionary and he is a practical person. And he has optimism. He told me early on, I can't remember what wasn't going very well, and I thought, will people ever begin working together? And he told me the story of the 100th monkey. And I can't remember the story exactly, but something about evolution, and it was the 100th monkey that actually then we began to make a change. And he said, I believe in the 100th monkey. We just keep working at it. What a wonderful mentor. When I did a few things that were a problem. I remember one time I spoke to a reporter, and it was against policy. I was supposed to have had that cleared with him, and with good reason, because these things are controversial. And but Reagan was great. Yeah, you should have talked to me first, but we'll be fine. And even times when perhaps a meeting that we were co-facilitating, he might say afterwards, I'd like for you to look at me more often because I can give you some clues about what direction we should be heading, But wonderful mentor, wonderful. He would listen to my ideas and let me run with them. And actually the ideas were always good. It's just that sometimes the execution, we'd have a problem that wouldn't work quite the way we wanted it to, but we worked together on figuring out solutions. Like when that $100,000 grant, we ran into trouble with using it the way we wanted to because we hadn't thought about this backlash. We came up with a solution to start water literate leaders. We always could figure out how to take the difficulty and figure out something that would work even better. And it was fun working with him in that way. Have a great deal of admiration. Who have I mentored? Well, I've mentored Julie a little bit, Julie Kallenberger. I think I mentored those students, those Hispanic DACA students. One of those students, he was having a hard time in his engineering classes. And he was studying to be a civil engineer. And one summer, he was about to flunk one of his classes for the second time. And that was the summer when I was driving to Denver for a meeting with those students in the non-air conditioned place, and we were sweating. And so he and I would be in the car together quite a bit, and he was really, really suffering. I don't know if I can be an engineer. I don't know what to do, etc. And so I called Neil Grigg, who is a professor of engineering at CSU, who everyone loves, and he's just a great person. And he didn't have time to meet with Hugo because he's called on for everything. But he said, I want you to tell Hugo something. Tell him that all he needs is a C-. If he can get through engineering school with a C-, it's not going to make a big difference at all in his career. Hang in there, Hugo. You will make it. And I just had an email from Hugo 3 days ago. He got his engineering degree. I was a little worried about what the pandemic did. He got his damn degree, and he's out there. And he's communicating with people whose contact information I've given him, looking for a job. And I think I'm probably most proud of mentoring Hugo.
What do you want future generations to know about you and the organizations that you've worked for?
Ooh. Oh, that's a fun question. Well, everything that I've done, I've brought creativity to the task. And I didn't have to have a lot of money or resources. I could figure out how to use leftovers. I'm a great leftovers cook. I'd rather cook with leftovers than having all the wonderful ingredients, expensive ingredients. I love seeing what's available and building from it, whether it's the Girl Scout troop, with the idea that these girls are going to need to know how to be women who are capable, not necessarily just professional women, but they need to be able to, if they're a plumber, if they are a school teacher, if they're a lawyer, they need to be equal and know they're equal in this world. Whatever I have done, I've just wanted to help people meet their potential. And one of my least favorite sayings in the world is, well, I brought myself up by the bootstraps. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. We who are successful, most of us did not bring ourselves up by the bootstraps. There are a few, but most of us had families who read to us, or we had some money back in the savings to help us go to college. I feel that we've got to reach out and help people, not help people, do things in our lives that create opportunities for us all to flourish. And if there's something I want people to remember about me, it's that in every case that I could, I was intent on bringing out the best in people and helping them to bring out the best in themselves and have fun doing it. I've loved speaking Spanish. I've loved writing. I love weeding. I love learning the names of all the different weeds, and I love native plants, and just whatever I do that I've enjoyed throwing myself into whatever I had the opportunity to. I do regret making a D in algebra in the 9th grade, but mostly I would like to leave a legacy of enjoying life, but having tremendous compassion for others and helping others to enjoy life as well.
Great. What advice do you have for present and future generations of water professionals in the state?
Don't be afraid of speaking out against rules in your organizations. Question authority. And it's happening with young people. I think young people are realizing they don't have to have a car. A lot more of them are taking public transportation until the pandemic. Question authority. Question the institutions. Get to know people of other political persuasions. Figure out what makes them tick. Figure out how to build between you. Whether it's ag, urban, environmental in terms of water, or whether it is we need small government versus we need to make sure people have a social net. Look at where those two could come together instead of staying in separate camps. That's what I would advise young people. And it's true for water and and for their neighbors and their neighborhoods and their children, and how they help their children to grow and to learn.
Similar question, what advice do you have for Colorado residents who want to be more responsible users of the precious resource that is water?
Learn, 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 and don't learn from just one source. If you belong to Save the Pooter, also find some agricultural ditch company people and become genuinely interested in what they're doing. Learn, learn, learn. The more we can learn about the various aspects, the more we will understand and be able to come up with creative solutions that optimize the resource.
Super. What haven't I asked you that you wanted to talk about in
You
this
did
conversation?
great. What fun. What an opportunity I have had to tell my story. I've enjoyed it very much.